a lot. Yeah, so just a quick question before we start off, copying Yuka's question about who knows what the meaning of the living income means. Hands up those who know what agroecology is. Oh, brilliant. Right. I wish one of you would come up here and do this presentation. That would be excellent. Okay, thank you. Okay. So I'm presenting on behalf of our team, which comprises Jean Nicolet and Mark Cotter from FIBL, the Organic Research Organization, and Valerie Nelson from Natural Resources, University of Greenwich, same as myself. Next slide, please. So agroecology is very much moving up the agenda globally. In the last food summit, it was featured, and that moving up the global agenda includes here in the European Union, where it's being seen as an attempt to improve both social and environmental outcomes to achieve healthy, sustainable, inclusive agricultural and food chain. And within the European Union, the strategy to for the EU would include increasing international cooperation on food and innovation. And there, one of the stated approaches to trying to achieve that is through agroecology. So this study was commissioned to understand the relationship between agroecology, responsible value chains, markets, and agricultural and food systems transformation using the VCA4D studies. And I think one thing you'll find through this presentation, there's a bit of a mix between the term transformation and transition. And of course, that's perhaps at the core of the whole debate. So we had 5 study questions. The first was, what are the main characteristics of the value chain systems? And to the extent the agricultural setting in which they exist. What is the extent and nature of alignment of agroecological principles in the value chain studied? To what extent has production according to agroecological principles contributed to the development of responsible subchains? How is market demand expressed, and to what extent has market demand contributed to the development of the application of agroecological principles? And finally, what are the conditions enabling or constraining agroecological transitions of farming and food systems and value chains? Next slide, please. So agroecology is a contested term. There are various understandings of what it means. Often that's captured from a paper from Wesel that talked about agroecology being a science, a practice, and a social movement, and even a political movement, and sometimes all those things at the same time. And as the diagram on the right shows, the term itself has got a long history going back at least into the 1930s. And over time, how it's been used has been this mixture of science, practice, and social movement. And now increasingly, it's been talked about in policy terms. What does policy mean for agroecology? And parallel to that process, the idea of agroecology has moved from the field to the farm and now to the food system. So what does an agroecological food system look like? It's now been considered. Alongside that, there's quite an academic strand of thinking that that agroecology is also very much about knowledge, culture, ethics, and politics. And this way of thinking about agroecology, to some extent, challenges the idea of technology and markets. And that's part of what we'll be looking at a bit later. Next slide, please. So because of the contestation around agroecology, we decided to play it safe. And we used the high-level panel of experts, Food Security and Nutrition, 13 principles of agroecology, which is an attempt to find consensus around what agroecology is. And this aligns broadly with the FAO's attempt to do the same thing with their 10 elements of agroecology. So listed here are the key words for each of these 13 agroecological principles. And to some extent, you could say that the first 7 of these principles, recycling, input reduction, soil health, animal health, biodiversity, synergy, and economic diversification, to some extent, you could think of as production principles, production agroecological principles. And then the 8 to 13, co-creation of knowledge, social values and diets, fairness, connectivity, land and natural resource governance, and participation, you could think of, if you like, as responsibility type principles. And although, again, the idea of responsibility in value chains is very much debated and contested, and there's many frameworks that have tried to capture that, for practical reasons, we decided to use these principles 8 to 13 as our guide to whether a value chain was more or less socially equitable and socially responsible. Next slide, please. So we use this this framework to do a rapid screening of 36 value chain studies, which you can see sort of organized on the table on the left there. And from those 36, we selected case studies. Basic criteria were, through the rapid screening, was there any indication at all that these value chains or sub-chains within the value chains looked reasonably agroecological against those principles? So that was our first attempt, or at least some of the sub-chains were. And then secondly, if they were, was there enough information in the report to allow us to do the assessment? And from that, we identified 7 case studies, which you can see there. And a further criterion, to some extent, that we wanted to do was to look. We wanted to look at both internationally traded global commodity value chains, and we wanted to look at more national or regional sort of food-based value chains. And so we ended up with the 5 international ones that you can see there, and the 2 national or regional ones. And within these, we have 18 sub-chains that we identified. In the analysis, the limitations, there were some limitations, including that the framing of through a value chain is very different of a framing from through agroecology, which is often sort of more of a territorial-based framing. So that was quite challenging to align. Secondly, information gaps were in place. And thirdly, because this was mainly a snapshot in time, it was quite challenging to look for causality from the evidence in the studies. Next slide, please. So this is a sort of summary of our assessment. I don't think you'll be able to read it, but it's just to give you an idea that across the top of the 13 principles and down the side are the 18 sub-chains from the 7 commodity value chains. So for example, at the top there, you've got Ethiopia, where we selected 2 contrasting sub-chains. One, the large-scale conventional and commercial cotton sub-chain, and 2, a very small existing cotton, certified cotton sub-chain. So that's just an example. And another example on lower down from Papua New Guinea, we selected the vanilla organic sub-chain and the vanilla conventional sub-chain. But again, an example of the challenge was that in Papua New Guinea, the analysis wasn't in the sub-chain wasn't made on that basis. So we kind of pulled it together with information, partly because I was involved in the study itself, that allowed us to do it. And the same with the Ethiopia, because one of our team members, Jean, was part of the Ethiopia study. That helped us to pull together evidence that wasn't fully documented in the report. So what you can perhaps see from this table, obviously contrasting, if you take what might be called the production principles, the first 7, you see a lot more green. In other words, the production principles generally are more aligned with the agroecological, sorry, the sub-chains are more aligned with the agroecology production principles than they are with the equity and social responsibility principles. The second point is that within one commodity chain, you can see there can be major differences between these subchains, how much they align with the principles. So green is very high alignment, red is no or very low alignment, and then the spectrum in between. We then scored it then 1 to 5, 5 for high alignment, 1 for very low alignment, and we ended up with, then we averaged the scores on a simple average to give a score for production principles and a score for social responsibility principles, and that then forms the basis of the next step. Next slide, please. So what we see here then is that for the internationally traded global value chains, you've got this range for example, the cotton from very low for the industrial through to very high or very high for the cocoa gourmet subchain in Nicaragua, which was both organic certified or direct trade. Within the same value chain, you can have a lot of variation. So for example, Honduras coffee varied from low to moderate for the conventional to high for organic. In the domestic regional value chains, the Côte d'Ivoire cassava was scored low, and in the Ghana groundnuts artisanal subchain was scored moderate. On some of the individual principles, for example, some indications were that for recycling principles, there was generally higher alignment with perennial crops. Input reduction, where there was environmental standards in place, that there tended obviously to be lower input reduction, as lower input use, but also some crops seem to lend themselves to being viable without external inputs, an example being vanilla, for example. And then biodiversity can also vary hugely within a subchain. So PNG vanilla, it's grown as a monocrop sometimes it's intercrop with food crops, and sometimes it's part of an agroforestry system. And also it's important, what did it replace? What was in the ground before the vanilla was put in place? In terms of the equity and social responsibility principles, again, a wide range of alignment within the same commodity value chains, ranging from, for example, low to very low, up to high for the conventional cotton versus the organic cotton in Ethiopia. And then these sustainability standards, though, although they would tend to lead to higher responsibility principle alignment, they still fell short in many areas. So, for example, co-creation of knowledge, the co-creation of knowledge was often about the organic standard as much as it was about wider knowledge. The social values and diet, this depended on the commodity to what extent it supported the principle of social value and diet. Fairness, even though a standard, it could be organically certified, this may or not result in a great deal of fairness. For example, the organic cotton in Ethiopia, that created a lot more fairness, but in the organic vanilla in Papua New Guinea, it didn't make much difference between that and the conventional. Connectivity, certainly for internationally traded global value chains, connectivity, short value chains are highly unlikely, of course. And then in terms of land and natural resources governance, sustainability standards very rarely proactively change land rights, for example. Next slide, please. I better speed up a bit. The next question is then, to what extent has production, according to these principles, contributed to the development of responsible subchains? At the internationally traded value chain level, in some instances, it seems that the production systems that were there prior to certification made certification relatively easy. The example here is Ethiopia. So in Ethiopia, it was organically certified, and this attracted support from an NGO and governments. And this in turn strengthened the producer organizations. And so that aligned with one of the principles of the agroecology. In PNG, the organic certification didn't seem to have any effect at all on the responsibility principles. In Ecuador, the shift to low input agroforestry cocoa production on explantation lands, this meant that all the subchains to some extent did lead themselves to sustainability certification. but that contrasts with the situation for cocoa in Nicaragua. In all three cases that we had, coffee, cocoa, two on cocoa and one on coffee, where the production was being done by larger scale, medium to large scale, in other words, not by smallholders, then by some definitions of the principles, these were not an option to consider as agroecological because they were not working with smallholders by that definition. And in the domestic or regional traded value chains, these Ghana artisanal subchain, for example, was very much rooted in the culture and tradition of Northern Ghana, and there was a high degree of connectivity, but there was no clear evidence that the way that the groundnuts was produced was particularly conducive to equity and social responsibility principles. Okay, next slide, please. Onto markets. Okay, so to what extent has this, the way the market demand is expressed, has this contributed to the development of the application of agroecological principles? We looked at three scenarios. The first one, where products were produced at least partially agroecologically, and they were differentiated on the market, and also with international certification, such as organic or Rainforest Alliance. Second category, where they were differentiated on the market, but without international certification, for example, participatory guarantee schemes, where different stakeholders come together, both producers and consumers and other actors, to try and create a market that with a sort of fairness aspects for both producers and consumers. And the third category, where they were produced at least partially agroecologically, but they were not differentiated in the market. And what we found was that for the international, we had many examples of certification, and that there was moderate to high alignment with the agricultural production principles. But in some cases, these producers were already aligned with agroecological production. So they didn't actually cause it to happen. It was the other way around. The other example for certification is that this had less influence on aligning subchains with equity and social responsibility principles. The case studies that we looked at, we couldn't find any examples within the VCA4D studies of this participatory guarantee scheme. So the only example that we do have of this, a reward, but not without certification, whether we did have some examples of direct trade happening in Ecuador and Nicaragua, for example. And then finally, for the national one, looking at artisanal groundnut Ghana subchains, this was moderately highly aligned with the production principles and moderately aligned with the equity and social responsibility principles, but there was no clear differentiation of products on the market. So it didn't seem like that the market in any way recognized that the way that the groundnuts were being produced, even though they were moderately highly aligned with agroecological principles. Next slide, please. So got just 3 slides to go. So we tried to look at what conditions enable or constrain these agroecological transitions based on the 7 case studies. And this first column shows what we came up with based on an assessment, if you like, according to value chain thinking. So according to value chain thinking, we identified these 8 conditions that can influence in terms of either enabling or constraining agroecological transitions. And that was partly the prevailing discourse, the characteristics of the commodity, the characteristics of the market, policies, the geographical context, the farmer organization situation, the capacity of service providers, and the nature of the research and innovation systems. All these things can either enable or constrain. But there's other ways of framing this same question, and the two sets of authors here, Katchu and El, they looked at scaling agroecology, and they also agree. They also came up with some of the same factors. So they also had markets, and they also had discourse. But for them, the overall conclusion was that the key thing was organization and social fabric. Everything else follows on from that, according to their analysis. And on the far right, sort of more different situation again, looking at domains of agroecological transitions. Anderson et al., they identified these 6 areas that could enable or disable, and they don't use the term markets. They talk about systems of economic exchange within which markets can sit, but also looking at other approaches to markets. But interestingly, across all 3 of these approaches, discourse is identified. Okay, so moving up very quickly to the final 2 slides. So this is implication for decision-making process. Firstly, this point about differences exist in agricultural understanding. So the HLPE principles are an attempt to build consensus, but there is ambiguity in these principles, and that needs to be recognized. And it also means that there is the option of co-optation happening if it's not clear what you're talking about when it comes to agroecology. How decision makers and other actors understand and frame agricultural and food system issues will inform their view of agroecology and its potential role. So it's really important to appreciate that. So what's the implication is that decision makers should support multi-stakeholder dialogue and learning around the situated potential of agroecology in specific contexts, making adequate space for plural values of these different stakeholders. In terms of the characteristics of the different types of value chain systems, the case studies illustrate the complexity and diversity of these global, regional, national, and local value chains, including this issue around telecoupling. In other words, the fact that there are socioeconomic and environmental effects, even though there's large distances between geographical distances, you can still have major effects as a result of something happening in one place, impacts in another place. So in terms of exploring potential for agroecology, decision makers need to appreciate these agricultural and food systems, the complexity, the diversity, and the multi-scale nature of them. And this issue about what is the appropriate balance in terms of these systems, in terms of global, national, and local systems. Okay, very quickly, alignment with the principles. There was wide variance of alignment, as already mentioned. And the social responsibility principles represent a greater challenge than the production principles because of the other parts of the wider system and other sectors for decision makers need to be taken into account, and there's need for more far-reaching shifts in economic systems and power relations. Okay, can AE production encourage more responsible value chains? Where the agricultural systems are well aligned with the production principles, it is easier to achieve environmental certification, but this may or may not lead to greater equity and social responsibility. And for the local value chains, even the question didn't seem quite right. So for local value chains, concepts, actions, and potential arrangements around responsibility need further exploration beyond the sort of the niche, like the participating guarantee system approach. Final slide.
And I hope it's not very comprehensive.
Okay.
Then we have to.
Yeah. Okay.
Can you?
Very quick.
Okay.
Key points. Okay. So the markets in agroecology, yes, they can have an influence on agroecological principles, but these other enabling conditions are really important. And depending on your definition of agroecology, those enabling conditions will vary. And that should be taken into account in terms of choice of support. And then for the HLP principles, mentioning this point about ambiguity, and one aspect about ambiguity is about who can be agroecological. Can it only be smallholders, or can it be medium and large holders? And then finally, for the VCA4D approach, taking agroecology into account, the approach in the future could perhaps explore more the dimensions of the HLP principles. It could look at more in-depth analysis of historical and future trends, and there could be greater integration of gender and intersectionality analysis. Thank you very much.
Thank you.